Richard Nixon is one of the most controversial, complicated, and interesting men in the whole of U.S. history. He has a complicated legacy. Yes, he was extremely corrupt. Yes, he tried to spy on his opponents in his campaign, and that extreme abuse of power ruined much of the respect the presidency had before, and it hasn't fully recovered. But he is a complicated figure. People are starting to understand that, and his legacy is actively being changed. But that legacy was nearly never even created. In fact, a little over half a decade before he was elected in a landslide victory in 1968, he was considered dead politically. How did this happen? And how was Nixon able to pull off one of the greatest political comebacks in all of history? Let's start back when Nixon was on top of the world, back in 1960. Right after he won the Republican nomination for president. He won the nomination with nearly 90% of the vote, a massive sweep. He was strong heading into the general election, not to mention that he was the vice president of a beloved, popular, and successful President Eisenhower, who was just about finishing off his second term. Everything was going Nixon's way. He was a younger man himself, but next to his opponent, John Kennedy, he had much more experience. Besides, Kennedy was a rich playboy. He couldn't relate to the common man, certainly not as well as Nixon, the farm boy from rural California. People generally thought that Kennedy hadn't earned his place at the table in this election, that his father, the very powerful Joseph Kennedy, had practically bought his way there for him, and that's really pretty true. But Kennedy had one major advantage over Nixon. He was charismatic. Nixon was not. While Kennedy was cool, confident, handsome, and everything else you'd find attractive, Nixon just wasn't. He was nervous, he was shaky, and just plain unattractive. This came through worst when the two had a televised debate, which all of this came through right in front of the millions who were watching this debate from home. It was his Achilles heel. Nixon went on to lose that election. But it wasn't over for him yet. I mean, look, sure he lost, but he lost by less than 120,000 votes nationwide. Just 0.2% of the popular vote. Besides, plenty of people had lost presidential elections in the past. It wasn't the end of the world, especially with how young he was. He surely had a long career in politics ahead of him. He already won a national election when he won the Republican nomination. If he could do that, he could win an election anywhere. 2 years after his narrow defeat on national ballots, Nixon's name was only seen on a ballot for one state. He was running for governor of California. Now, this would be a sweep. I mean, a former vice president, a man with national and even international recognition, should be able to mop the floor with anyone else in a statewide election. And when he did, it'd be the perfect bounce back for another presidential run in 1964. It was a great plan, but it had a problem. The reality of California politics during this election made it so that it wasn't just unlikely that he'd win, it was almost impossible. While Nixon denied that he was running for governor just so that he could ditch office and go run for president, that's what most people saw anyways. Reporters were just vicious with Nixon and the campaign, making all sorts of ugly personal attacks. Besides, he was running against an already popular and secure Pat Brown for governor. Someone on Nixon's campaign didn't consider the risks. While it was definitely important for him to stay important and prominent if he wanted a future in politics, putting him in a race which he was destined to lose would surely kill his career. As the nation watched, Nixon lost this race by nearly 5 points under Brown. They had not only watched him lose the presidency, now they watched a humiliating and career-killing defeat in his home state. It was so over for Nixon. After hearing the news, Nixon had an unprepared press conference where he said,
"I leave you gentlemen now, and you will now write it, you will interpret it, that's your right. But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
Nixon was devastated. This was a career-ending blow. In a private call, JFK and Pat Brown, the only two men to have ever defeated Nixon in an election, shared their notes. They both agreed that it was over for him. ABC aired a program called The Political Obituary of Richard Nixon. Reporters across the country were confident that this was the last the nation would see of the former vice president. He was a private citizen now, not just because he was out of position, but because seemingly nobody cared about him anymore. He went to work for a law firm, and while it was no small position, he was representing companies like Pepsi internationally. It certainly wasn't where his heart was at. He had gone from being Vice President of the United States, the second most powerful man in the whole of the world, to just some private lawyer in just 3 years. He hated this life, and said, "If all I had was my legal work, I would be mentally dead in 2 years and physically dead in 4. He knew he couldn't last being out of politics for life. It was his passion, and he decided that he wasn't done yet. In his position representing Pepsico, he traveled the world. Besides American politics, his greatest passion was probably foreign policy. He was one of the strongest foreign policy presidents we've ever had, and he saw an amazing possibility right in front of him. One which could vault him back into politics and maybe, one day, the White House. It was an ambitious plan, but if everything went well, he would be in the perfect position to take back his role as the leader of the Republican Party. Now look, since his presidential defeat in 1960 and the gubernatorial defeat in 1962, the world hadn't stood still. In fact, it was moving quite fast. JFK had been shot and killed in Dallas in '63, meaning that his vice president LBJ took over. Since JFK's death, the US's image globally had declined quite a bit. It suffered from internal and external instability. The world was in the thick of the Cold War. The US was in a proxy war with the USSR in Vietnam, a war which the vast majority of Americans disagreed with and thought was handled poorly. Besides all of this, LBJ signed controversial bills like the Civil Rights Act and also started the war against poverty. He was probably one of the most liberal presidents in our history, and also one of the most effective and strategic. By 1968, many believed that it would be LBJ on the Democratic ticket for president. But in a surprise move, he decided to drop out of the race. He believed that he had become too controversial a figure in the Democratic Party to secure a strong victory in the primaries, which would leave him weak heading into the general election. Bobby Kennedy, the younger brother of the former president, then became the frontrunner, but after his tragic death, the nomination instead went to Hubert Humphrey, the vice president under LBJ. Humphrey was a great role model and a model for any leader, a personal hero to me, but the Democratic Party was in a bad position. Closely linked to the unpopular economic policies of LBJ, as well as his unsuccessful foreign policy, he was in a bad position for an election year in which foreign policy would be more important than ever, and one where the people had become increasingly conservative in their values and in their voting. Nixon, in the meantime, was building back his public image. On his travels across the world, he met with numerous leaders from countless countries, flexing his strong foreign policy skills to the press. Also, in the nearly 6 years since his devastating defeats, he had become much more charismatic, much more confident, publicly, and was much less of the uncomfortable and nervous man that Americans had seen in 1960. On February 2nd, 1968, Nixon shocked the country by announcing his candidacy during the New Hampshire Republican primaries. Quickly, he became a part of the political arena again. In fact, it was almost too easy. But his only real competition for the Republican nomination was George Romney, governor of Michigan. But Nixon was ahead by miles. The Republican Party had been missing something for the past 8 years. That thing was leadership, and Nixon was a leader. Certainly not a natural leader, but a leader who earned his position in the Republican Party, and a man who had grown a lot, and who was no longer the man who had sulked away into private life after losing the gubernatorial election 6 years earlier. After he won the Republican nomination, it wasn't a sure path to the presidency, but it was a solid one. He was a champion of what he called the silent majority of Americans, who were tired of the disastrous war in Vietnam. They were tired of the social changes and the liberal policies brought on by the past 8 years of Democratic presidency. In polls, Nixon was winning by 15 points. The Democratic Party was fractured, with many Southern Democrats choosing to vote Dixiecrat with George Wallace, a segregationist and extreme conservative. By Election Day, Nixon won by 1 million votes over the Democrats. It was a stunning victory. A year before, Nixon was considered politically dead. No one could have expected this epic revival, or that he would go from being beyond help to the leader of the Republican Party, the nation, and the world in such a short time. This was a moment of triumph in Nixon's long career. But more important than the revival which he lived through was the one that he didn't. After he left the presidency, there was an irreparable stain left on the presidency and on his personal legacy. This stain has been something that the presidency hasn't been able to fully recover from. But Nixon himself, his legacy, is nearly revived. He got a lot of his respect back, and his power too. Though the man himself is dead, the legacy he made and the precedent he set for future presidents live on. His impact is real, and to this day he is an influential and controversial figure.